Familiar though his name may be to us, the storyteller in his living immediacy is by no means a present force. He has already become something remote from us and something that is getting even more distant. To present someone like Leskov as a storyteller does not mean bringing him closer to us, but rather increasing our distance from him. Viewed from a certain distance, the great, simple lines which define the storyteller stand out in him, or rather, become visible in him. Just as in a rock, a human head or an animal's body may appear to an observer at the proper distance and an angle of vision. This distance and this angle of vision are prescribed for us by an experience which we may have almost every day. It teaches us that the art of storytelling is coming to an end. Less and less frequently do we encounter people with the ability to tell a tale properly. More and more often there is embarrassment all around when the wish to hear a story is expressed. It is as if something that seemed inalienable to us, scarce among our possessions, were taken from us. The ability to exchange experiences. One reason for this phenomenon is obvious. Experience has fallen in value, and it looks as if it is continuing to fall into bottomlessness. Every glance at a newspaper demonstrates that this rich and new world, that our picture, not only of the external world, but of the moral world as well, overnight has undergone changes which were never thought possible. With the First World War, process began to become appearance which has not haunted since then. Was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poor in a communicable experience? What 10 years later was poured out in the flood of war books was anything but experience that goes from mouth to mouth. And there was nothing remarkable about that. For never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly than strategic experience by tactical warfare, economic experience by inflation, bodily experience by mechanical warfare, moral experience by those in power. A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in the countryside, in which nothing has remained unchanged but the clouds. Beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents, explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body.
Experience which is passed on from mouth to mouth is the source from which all storytellers have drawn, and among those who have written down the tales, it is the great ones whose written versions differ least from the speech of the many nameless storytellers. Incidentally, among the last named there are two groups which, to be sure, overlap in many ways, and the figure of the storyteller gets its full corporeality only for the one who can picture them both. When someone goes on a trip, he has something to tell about, goes the German saying, and people imagine the storyteller as someone who has come from afar. But they enjoy no less listening to the man who has stayed at home, making an honest living, and who knows the local tales and traditions. If one wants to picture these two groups through their archaic representatives, one is embodied in the resident tiller of the soil, and the other is the trading seaman. Indeed, each sphere of life has, as it were, produced its own tribe of storytellers. Each of these tribes preserves some of its characteristics centuries later. Thus, among 19th century German storytellers, writers like Hebel and Gottschalk stem from the first tribe writers like Seelfield and Gerstacker from the second. With these tribes, however, as stated above, it is only a matter of basic types. The actual extension of the realm of storytelling is of its full historical breadth is inconceivable without the most intimate interpenetration of these two archaic types. Such an interpenetration was achieved particularly by the Middle Ages in the trade structure. The resident master craftsman and the traveling journeyman, and every master has been a traveling journeyman before he settled down in his hometown or somewhere else. If peasants and seamen were past masters of storytelling, the artisan class was its university. In it was combined the lore of faraway places such as much traveled man brings home, with the lore of the past as the best reveals itself to natives of a place.
Leskov was at home in distant places, as well as distant times. He was a member of the Greek Orthodox Church, a man with genuine religious interests, but he was a no less sincere opponent of ecclesiastic bureaucracy. He was not able to get along any better with secular officialdom. The official positions he held were not of a long duration. Of all of his posts, the one he held for a long time as a Russian representative of a big English firm was presumably the most useful one for his writing. For this firm, he traveled through Russia, and these trips advanced his worldly wisdom, as much as they did his knowledge of conditions in Russia. In this way, he had an opportunity of becoming acquainted with the organization of the sects in the country. This left its mark on his works of fiction. In the Russian legends, Leskov saw allies in his fight against Orthodox bureaucracy. There are a number of his legendary tales whose focus is a righteous man, seldom an ascetic, usually a simple, active man, who becomes a saint apparently in the most natural way in the world. Mystical exaltation is not Leskov's forte, even though he occasionally liked to indulge in the miraculous, even in piousness. He prefers to stick with a sturdy nature. He sees the prototype in the man who finds his way about the world without getting too deeply involved with it. He displayed a corresponding attitude in the worldly matters. It is in keeping with this that he began to write late, at the age of 29. That was after his commercial travels. His first printed work was entitled, Why Are Books Expensive in Kiev? A number of other writings about the working class, alcoholism, police doctors, and unemployed salesmen are precursors of his works of fiction.
An orientation toward practical interests is characteristic of many born storytellers. More pronouncedly than in Leskov, this trait can be recognized, for example, in Gottschalk, who gave his peasants agricultural advice. It is found in Nodier, who concerned himself with the perils of gaslight, and Hebel, who slipped bits of scientific instruction for his readers into his Schatzkästlein, is in this line as well. All this points to the nature of every real story. It contains, openly or covertly, something useful. The usefulness may, in one case, consist in a moral, in another, in some practical advice, in a third, in a proverb or maxim. In every case, the storyteller is a man who has counsel for his readers. But if today having counsel is beginning to have an old-fashioned ring, this is because the communicability of experience is decreasing. In consequence, we have no counsel either for ourselves or for others. After all, counsel is less an answer to a question than a proposal concerning the continuation of a story which is just unfolding. To seek this counsel, one would first have to be able to tell the story, quite apart from the fact that a man is receptive to counsel only to the extent that he allows his situation to speak. Counsel woven into the fabric of real life is wisdom. The art of storytelling is reaching its end because the epic side of truth, wisdom, is dying out. This, however, is a process that has been going on for a long time, and nothing would be more fatuous than to want to see in it merely a symptom of decay, let alone a modern symptom. It is, rather, only a concomitant symptom of the secular productive forces of history, a concomitant that has quite gradually removed narrative from the realm of living speech and at the same time is making it possible to see a new beauty in what is vanishing.
The earliest symptom of a process whose end is the decline of storytelling is the rise of the novel at the beginning of modern times. What distinguishes the novel from the story, and from the epic in the narrower sense, is its essential dependence on the book. The dissemination of the novel became only possible with the invention of printing. What can be handed on orally, the wealth of the epic, is of a different kind from what constitutes stock in trade of the novel. What differentiates the novel from all other forms of prose literature, the fairy tale, the legend, even the novella, is that it neither comes from the oral tradition nor goes into it. This distinguishes it from storytelling in particular. The storyteller takes what he tells from experience, his own or that reported by others, and in turn, he makes the experience of those who are listening to his tale. The novelist has isolated himself. The birthplace of the novel is the solitary individual who is no longer able to express himself by giving examples of his most important concerns. He is himself uncounseled and cannot counsel others. To write a novel means to carry the incommensurable to extremes in the representation of human life. In the midst of life's fullness and through representation of this fullness, the novel gives evidence of profound perplexity of the living. Even the first great book of the genre, Don Quixote, teaches how the spiritual greatness, the boldness, the helpfulness of one of the noblest men, Don Quixote, are completely devoid of counsel and do not contain the slightest scintilla of wisdom. If now and then, in the course of the centuries, efforts have been made, most effectively perhaps in Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahr, to implant instruction in the novel, these attempts have always amounted to a modification of the novel form. The Bildungsroman, on the other hand, does not deviate in any way from the basic structure of the novel. By integrating the social process with the development of a person, it bestows the most frangible justification on the order determining it. The legitimacy it provides standing in direct opposition to reality. Particularly in the Bildungsroman, it is this inadequacy that is actualized.
One must imagine the transformation of epic forms occurring in rhythms comparable to those of the change that has come over the Earth's surface in the course of thousands of centuries. Hardly any other forms of human communication have taken shape more slowly, been lost more slowly. It took the novel, whose beginnings go back to antiquity, hundreds of years before it encountered in the evolving middle class those elements which were favorable to its flowering. With the appearance of these elements, storytelling began quite slowly to recede into the archaic. In many ways, it is true, it took hold of the new material, but it was not really determined by it. On the other hand, we recognize that with the full control of the middle class, which has the press as one of its most important instruments in the fully developed capitalism, there emerges a form of communication which, no matter how far back its origins may lie, never before influenced the epic form in a decisive way. But now it does exert such an influence, and it turns out that it confronts storytelling as no less of a stranger than did the novel, but in a more menacing way, and that it also brings about a crisis in the novel. This new form of communication is information. Villemessant, the founder of Le Figaro, characterized the nature of information in a famous formulation. "To my readers," he used to say, "an attic fire in the Latin Quarter is more important than a revolution in Madrid." This makes strikingly clear that it is no longer intelligence coming from afar, but the information which supplies a handle for what is nearest that gets the readiest hearing. The intelligence that came from afar, whether the spatial kind from foreign countries or the temporal kind of tradition, possessed an authority which gave it validity, even when it was not subject to verification. Information, however, lays claim to prompt verifiability. The prime requirement is that it appear understandable in itself. Often it is no more exact than the intelligence of earlier centuries was, but while the latter was inclined to borrow from the miraculous, it is indispensable for information to sound plausible. Because of this, it proves incompatible with the spirit of storytelling. If the art of storytelling has become rare, the dissemination of information has had a decisive share in this state of affairs. Every morning brings us the news of the globe, and yet we are poor in noteworthy stories. This is because no event any longer comes to us without already being shot through with explanation. In other words, by now almost nothing that happens benefits storytelling. Almost everything benefits information. Actually, it is half the art of storytelling to keep a story free from explanation as one reproduces it. Leskov is a master at this. Compare pieces like The Deception and The White Eagle. The most extraordinary things, marvelous things, are related with the greatest accuracy, but the psychological connections of the events is not forced on the reader. It is left up to him to interpret the things the way he understands them, and thus the narrative achieves an amplitude that information lacks.
Leskov was grounded in the classics. The first storyteller of the Greeks was Herodotus. In the 14th chapter of the third book of his histories, there is a story from which much can be learned. It deals with Samanitus. When the Egyptian king Samanitus had been beaten and captured by the Persian king Cambyses, Cambyses was bent on humbling his prisoner. He gave orders to place Samanitus on the road along which the Persian triumphal procession was to pass. And he further arranged that the prisoner should see his daughter pass by as a maid going to the well with her pitcher. While all the Egyptians were lamenting and bewailing this spectacle, Samanitus stood alone, mute and motionless, his eyes fixed on the ground. And when presently he saw his son, who was being taken along in the procession to be executed, he likewise remained unmoved. But when afterwards he recognized one of his servants, an old, impoverished man, in the ranks of the prisoners, he beat his fists against his head and gave all the signs of deepest mourning. From this story, it may be seen what the nature of true storytelling is. The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only at that moment. It has to surrender to it completely and explain itself to it without losing any time. A story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing it even after a long time. Thus Montaigne referred to this Egyptian king and asked himself why he mourned only when he caught sight of his servant. Montaigne answers, "Since he was already overfull of grief, it took only the smallest increase for it to burst through its dams." Thus Montaigne. But one could also say, "The king is not moved by the fate of those of royal blood, for it is his own fate." Or, "We are moved by much on the stage that does not move us in real life. To the king, the servant is only an actor." Or, "Great grief is pent up and breaks forth only with relaxation. Seeing this servant was the relaxation." Herodotus offers no explanations. His report is the driest. That is why the story from ancient Egypt is still capable, after thousands of years, of arousing astonishment and thoughtfulness. It resembles the seeds of grain which have lain for centuries in the chambers of the pyramids, shut up airtight, and have retained their germinative power to this day.
There is nothing that commends a story to memory more effectively than that chaste compactness which precludes psychological analysis, and the more natural the process by which the storyteller forgoes psychological stating, the greater becomes the story's claim to a place in memory of the listener. The more completely is it integrated into his own experience, the greater will be his inclination to repeat it to someone else someday, sooner or later. This process of assimilation, which takes place in depth, requires a state of relaxation, which is becoming rare and rare. If sleep is the apogee of physical relaxation, and boredom is the apogee of mental relaxation, boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. The rustling in the leaves drives him away. His nesting places, the activities that are intimately associated with boredom, already extinct in the cities and are declining in the country as well. With this gift for listening is lost and the community of listeners disappears. For storytelling is always the art of repeating stories, and this art is lost when the stories are no longer retained. It is the loss because there is no more weaving and spinning to go on while they are being listened to. The more self-forgetful the listener is, the more deeply is what he listens to impressed upon his memory. When the rhythm of work has seized him, he listens to the tales in such a way that the gift of retelling them comes to him all by himself. This, then, is the nature of the web in which the gift of storytelling is cradled. The This is how today it is becoming unraveled at all its ends after being woven thousands of years ago in the ambience of the oldest forms of craftsmanship.
The storytelling that thrives for a long time in the milieu of work, the rural, the maritime, and the urban, is itself an artisan form of communication, as it were. It does not aim to convey the pure essence of the thing like information or a report. It sinks the thing into the life of the storyteller in order to bring it out of him again. Thus, traces of the storyteller cling to the story the way the handprints of the potter cling to the clay vessel. Storytellers tend to begin their story with a presentation of the circumstances in which they themselves have learned what it is to follow, unless they simply pass it off as their own experience. Leskov begins his deception with the description of a train trip on which he supposedly heard from a fellow passenger the events which he then goes on to relate. Or he thinks of Dostoevsky's funeral, where he sets his acquaintance with the heroine of his story, apropos of the Kreutzer Sonata, or he evokes a gathering of a reading circle in which we are told the events that he produces for us in his interesting men. Thus, his tracks are frequently evident in his narratives, if not as those of the one who experienced it, then as those of the one who reports it. This craftsmanship, storytelling, was actually regarded as a craft by Leskov himself. Writing, he says in one of his letters, is to me no liberal art but a craft. It cannot come as a surprise that he felt bonds with craftsmanship but faced industrial technology as a stranger. Tolstoy, who must have understood this, occasionally touches this nerve of Leskov's storytelling talent when he calls him the first man who pointed out the inadequacy of economic progress. It is strange that Dostoevsky is so widely read, but I simply cannot comprehend why Leskov is not read. He is a truthful writer. In his artful and high-spirited story, The Steel Flea, which is midway between legend and farce, Leskov glorifies native craftsmanship through the silversmiths of Tula. Their masterpiece, The Steel Flea, is seen by Peter the Great and convinces him that the Russians need not be ashamed before the English. The intellectual picture of the atmosphere of craftsmanship from which the storyteller comes has perhaps never been sketched in such a significant way as by Paul Valery. He speaks of the perfect things in nature, flawless pearls, full-bodied, matured wines, truly developed creatures, and calls them the precious product of a long chain of causes similar to one another. The accumulation of such causes has its temporal limit only at perfection. This patient process of nature, Valery continues, was once imitated by men. Miniatures, ivory carvings elaborated to the point of greatest perfection, stones that are perfect in polish and engraving, lacquer work or paintings in which a series of thin, transparent layers are placed one on top of the other. All of these products of sustained, sacrificing effort are vanishing, and the time is past in which time did not matter. Modern man no longer works at what cannot be abbreviated. In point of fact, he has succeeded in abbreviating even storytelling. We have witnessed the evolution of the short story, which has removed itself from oral tradition and no longer permits that slow piling one on top of the other of thin, transparent layers which constitutes the most appropriate picture of the way in which the perfect narrative is revealed through the layers of a variety of retellings.
Valery concludes his observations with this sentence. It is almost as if the decline of the idea of eternity coincided with the increasing aversion to sustained effort. The idea of eternity has ever had its strongest source in death. If this idea declines, so we reason, the face of death must have changed. It turns out that this change is identical with the one that has diminished the communicability of experience to the same extent as the art of storytelling has declined. It has been observable for a number of centuries how in the general consciousness the thought of death has declined in omnipresence and vividness. In its last stages, this process is accelerated. And in the course of the 19th century, bourgeois society has, by means of hygienic and social, private and public institutions, realized a secondary effect which may have been its subconscious main purpose, to make it possible for people to avoid the sight of the dying. Dying was once a public process in the life of the individual and a most exemplary one. Think of the medieval pictures in which the deathbed has turned into a throne toward which the people press through the wide open doors of the death house. In the course of modern times, dying has been pushed further and further out of the perceptual world of the living. There used to be no house, hardly a room in which someone had not once died. The Middle Ages also felt spatially what makes that inscription on the sundial of a visa, Ultima Maltis, the last day for many, significant as the temper of the times. Today people live in rooms that have never been touched by death, dry dwellers of eternity, and when their end approaches they are stowed away in sanatoria or hospitals by their heirs. It is, however, characteristic that not only a man's knowledge or wisdom, but above all his real life, and this is the stuff that stories are made of, first assumes transmissible form at the moment of his death. Just as a sequence of images is set in motion inside a man as his life comes to an end, unfolding the views of himself under which he has encountered himself without being aware of it, suddenly in his expressions and looks the unforgettable emerges and imparts to everything that concerned him that authority which even the poorest wretch in dying possesses for the living around him. This authority is at the very source of the story.
Death is the sanction of everything that the storyteller can tell. He has borrowed his authority from death. In other words, it is natural history to which his stories refer back. This is expressed in exemplary form in one of the most beautiful stories we have by the incomparable Johann Peter Hebel. It is found in the Schatzkistlein des Rheinischen Hausfreundes, is entitled Unexpected Reunion, and begins with the betrothal of a young lad who works in the mines of Fallen. On the eve of his wedding, he dies a miner's death at the bottom of his tunnel. His bride keeps faith with him after his death, and she lives long enough to become a wizened old woman. One day, a body is brought up from the abandoned tunnel, which, saturated with iron vitriol, has escaped decay, and she recognizes her betrothed. After this reunion, she too is called away by death. When Hebel, in the course of this story, was confronted with the necessity of making this long period of years graphic, he did so in the following sentences. In the meantime, the city of Lisbon was destroyed by an earthquake, and the 7 Years' War came and went, and Emperor Francis I died, and the Jesuit order was abolished, and Poland was partitioned, and Empress Maria Theresa died, and Struensee was executed. America became independent, and the united French and Spanish forces were unable to capture Gibraltar. The Turks locked up General Stein in the Vetriane cave in Hungary, and Emperor Joseph died also. King Gustavus of Sweden conquered Russian Finland, and the French Revolution and the Long War began, and Emperor Leopold II went to his grave too. Napoleon captured Prussia, and the English bombarded Copenhagen, and the peasants sowed and harvested. The millers ground, the smiths hammered, and the miners dug for veins of ore in their underground workshops. But when, in 1809, the miners at Falun. Never has a storyteller embedded his report deeper in natural history than Hebel manages to do in this chronology. Read it carefully. Death appears in it with the same regularity as the reaper does in the processions that pass around the cathedral clock at noon.
Any examination of a given epic form is concerned with the relationship of this form to historiography. In fact, one may even go further and raise the question whether historiography does not constitute the common ground of all forms of the epic. Then written history would be in the same relationship to the epic forms as white light is to the colors of the spectrum. However this may be, among all forms of the epic, there is not one whose incidence in the pure, colorless light of written history is more certain than the chronicle. And in the broad spectrum of the chronicle, the ways in which the story can be told are graduated like shadings of one and the same color. The chronicler is the history teller. If we think back to the passage of Hebel, which has the tone of the chronicle throughout, it will take no effort to gauge the difference between the writer of the history, the historian, and the teller of it, and the chronicler. The historian is bound to explain in one way or another the happenings with which he deals. Under no circumstances he content himself with displaying them as models of the course of the world. But this precisely is what the chronicler does, especially in his classical representatives. The chronicler of the Middle Ages, the precursor of the historians today. By basing their historical tales on divine plan of salvation, an inscrutable one, They have, from the very start, lifted the burden of demonstrable explanation from their own shoulders. It takes place by interpretation, which is not concerned with the accurate concatenation of definite events, but with the way these are embedded in the great inscrutable course of the world. Whether this course is eschatologically determined or is a natural one makes no difference. In The Storyteller, the chronicler is preserved in changed forms, secularized as it were. Leskov is among those whose works display with this particular clarity. Both the chronicler with his eschatological orientation and the storyteller with his profane outlook are so represented in his works that in a number of his stories it can hardly be decided whether the web in which they appear is the golden fabric of a religious view of the course of things or the multicolored fabric of a worldly view. Consider the story The Alexandrite, which transports the reader into that old time when the stones in the womb of the earth and the planets at celestial heights were still concerned with the fate of men, and not today when both in the heavens and beneath the earth everything has grown indifferent to the fates of the Son of Man, and no voice speaks to them from anywhere, let alone does their bidding. None of the undiscovered planets play any part in horoscopes anymore, and there are a lot of new stones, all measured and weighed and examined for their specific weight and their destiny, but they no longer proclaim anything to us, nor do they bring us any benefit. Their time for speaking with men is past. As is evident, it is hardly possible unambiguously to characterize the course of the world that is illustrated in the story of Leskov's. It is determined eschatologically or naturalistically. The only certain thing is that its very nature is by the definition outside all real historical categories. Leskov tells us that the epoch in which man could believe himself to be in harmony with nature has expired. Schiller called this epoch in the history of the world of the period of naive poetry. The storyteller keeps faith with it, and his eyes do not stray from that dial in front of which there moves the procession of creatures of which, depending on circumstances, death is either the leader or the last wretched straggle.
It has seldom been realized that the listener's naive relationship to the storyteller is controlled by his interest in retaining what he is told. The cardinal point for the unaffected listener is to assure himself of the possibility of reproducing the story. Memory is the epic's faculty par excellence. Only by virtue of a comprehensive memory can epic writing absorb the course of events on the one hand, and with the passing of these make its peace with the power of death on the other. It is not surprising that to a simple man of the people, such as Leskov once invented, the Tsar, the head of the sphere in which his stories take place, has the most encyclopedic memory at his command. Our emperor, he says, and his entire family have indeed a most astonishing memory. Mezzanine, the rememberer, was the muse of the epic art among the Greeks. This name takes the observer back to a parting of the ways in world history. For it, the record kept by memory, historiography, constitutes the creative matrix of the various epic forms, as great prose is the matrix of the various metrical forms. Its oldest form, the epic, by virtue of being a kind of common denominator, includes the story and the novel. When, in the course of the centuries, the novel began to emerge from the womb of the epic, it turned out that in the novel, the element of the epic mind that is derived from the muse, that is, memory, manifests itself in a form quite different from the way it manifests itself in the story. Memory creates a chain of tradition which passes a happening on from generation to generation. It is the muse-derived element of the epic art in a broader sense and encompasses its varieties. In the first place among these is the one practiced by the storyteller. It starts the web which all stories together form in the end. One ties on to the next, as the great storytellers, particularly the Oriental ones, have always readily shown.
In each of them there is a Scheherazade who thinks of a fresh story whenever her tale comes to a stop. This is epic remembrance and the muse-inspired element of the narrative. But this should be set against another principle, also a muse-derived element in a narrower sense, which, as an element of the novel in its earliest form, that is, in the epic, lies concealed, still undifferentiated from the similarly derived element of the story. It can, at any rate, occasionally be divined in the epics, particularly at moments of solemnity in the Homeric epics, as in the invocations to the muse at their beginning. What announces itself is in these passages is the perpetuating remembrance of the novelist as contrasted with the short-lived reminiscence of the storyteller. The first is dedicated to one hero, one odyssey, one battle, the second to many diffuse occurrences. It is, in other words, remembrance, which, as the muse-derived element of the novel is added to reminiscence, the corresponding element of the story, the unity of their origin and memory, having disappeared with the decline of the epic.
No one, Pascal once said, dies so poor that he does not leave something behind. Surely it is the same with memories, too, although these do not always find an heir. The novelist takes charge of this bequest, and seldom without profound melancholy. For what Arnold Bennett says about a dead woman in one of his novels, that she had almost nothing in the way of real life, is usually true of the sum total of the estate which the novelist administers. Regarding this aspect of the matter, we owe the most important elucidation to George Lukács, who sees in the novel the form of transcendental homelessness. According to Lukács, the novel is at the same time the only art form which includes time among its constitutive principles. Time, he says in his theory of the novel, can become constitutive only when connection with the transcendental home has been lost. Only in the novel are meaning and life, and thus the essential and the temporal, separated. One can almost say that the whole interaction of a novel is nothing else but a struggle against the power of time, and from this arise the genuinely epic experiences of time, hope and memory. Only in the novel does there occur a creative memory which transfixes the object and transforms it. The duality of inwardness and outside world can here be overcome for the subject only when he sees the unity of his entire life, out of the past life stream which is compressed in memory. The insight which grasps this unity becomes the divinatory, intuitive grasping of the unattained and therefore inexpressible meaning of life. The meaning of life is really the center about which the novel moves, but the quest for it is no more than the initial expression of perplexity with which its reader sees himself living this written life. Here, meaning of life, there, moral of the story. With these slogans, novel and story confront each other, and from them the totally different historical coordinates of these art forms may be discerned. If Don Quixote is the earliest perfect specimen of the novel, its latest exemplar is perhaps the Éducation Sentimentale. The final words of the last-named novel, the meaning which the bourgeois age found in its behavior at the beginning of its decline, has settled like sediment in the cup of life. Frederic and Delorier, the boyhood friends, think back to their youthful friendship. This little incident then occurred. One day they showed up in the bordello of their hometown, stealthily and timidly, doing nothing but presenting the patron with a bouquet of flowers, which they had picked in their own gardens. This story was still discussed 3 years later, and they now told it to each other in detail, each supplementing the recollection of the other. "That may have been," said Frederic when they finished, "the finest thing in our lives." "Yes, you may be right," said Delorier. "That was perhaps the finest thing in our lives." With such an insight, the novel reaches an end which is more proper to it, in a stricter sense, than to any story. Actually, there is no story for which the question as to how it continued would not be legitimate. The novelist, on the other hand, cannot hope to take the smallest step beyond that limit at which he invites the reader to a divinatory realization of the meaning of life by writing "Fini."
A man listening to a story is in the company of the storyteller. Even a man reading one shares this companionship. The reader of a novel, however, is isolated, more so than any other reader. for even the reader of a poem is ready to utter the words for the benefit of the listener. In this solitude of his, the reader of a novel seizes upon his material more jealously than anyone else. He is ready to make it completely his own, to devour it, as it were. Indeed, he swallows up the material as the fire devours logs in the fireplace. The suspense which permeates the novel is very much like the draught which stimulates the flame in the fireplace and enlivens its play. It is the dry material on which the burning interest of the reader feeds. A man who dies at the age of 35, said Moritz Heinemann once, is at every point in his life a man who dies at the age of 35. Nothing is more dubious than the sentence, but for the sole reason that the tense is wrong. A man, so says the truth that was meant here, who died at 35, will appear to remembrance at every point in his life as a man who died at the age of 35. In other words, the statement that makes no sense for real life becomes indisputable for remembered life. The nature of the character in a novel cannot be presented any better than is done in the statement, which says that the meaning of his life is revealed only in his death. But the reader of a novel actually does look for human beings from whom he derives the meaning of life. Therefore he must, no matter what, know in advance that he will share their experience of death, if need be their figurative death, the end of the novel, but preferably their actual one. How do the characters make him understand that death is already waiting for them, a very definite death and at a very definite place? That is the question which feeds the reader's consuming interest in the events of the novel. The novel is significant, therefore, not because it presents someone else's fate to us, perhaps didactically, but because the stranger's fate, by virtue of the flame which consumes it, yields us the warmth which we never draw from our own fate. What draws the reader to the novel is the hope of warming his shivering life with the death he reads about.
Leskov, writes Gorky, is the writer most deeply rooted in the people, and is completely untouched by any foreign influences. A great storyteller will always be rooted in the people, primarily in milieu of craftsmen. But just as this includes the rural, the maritime, and the urban elements in the many stages of their economic and technical development, there are many gradations in the concepts in which their store of experience comes down to us. To say nothing of the by no means insignificant share which traders had in the art of storytelling, their task was less to increase its didactic content than to refine the tricks with which the attention of the listener was captured. They have left deep traces in the narrative cycle of the Arabian Nights. In short, despite the primary role which storytelling plays in the household of humanity, the concepts through which the yield of the stories may be garnered are manifold. What may most readily be put in religious terms in Leskov seems almost automatically to fall into place in the pedagogical perspectives of the Enlightenment in Hebel, appears as Hermetic tradition in Poe, finds a last refuge in Kipling in the life of the British seamen and colonial soldiers. All great stories have in common the freedom with which they move up and down the rungs of their experience, as on a ladder. A ladder extending downwards to the interior of the earth and disappearing into the clouds is the image for a collective experience to which even the deepest shock of every individual experience, death, constitutes no impediment or barrier. And they lived happily ever after, says the fairy tale. The fairy tale, which to this day is the first tutor of children because it was once the first tutor of mankind, secretly lives on in the story. The first true storyteller is, and will continue to be, the teller of fairy tales. Whenever good counsel was at its premium, the fairy tale had it, and where the need was greatest, its aid was nearest. This need was the need created by the myth. The fairy tale tells us of the earliest arrangements that mankind made to shake off the nightmare which the myth had placed upon its chest. In the figure of the fool, it shows us how mankind acts dumb towards the myth. In the figure of the youngest brother, it shows us how one's chances increase as the mythical primitive times are left behind. In the figure of the man who sets out to learn what fear is, it shows us the things we are afraid of can be seen through. In the figure of the wiseacre, it shows us that the questions posed by the myth are simple-minded, like the riddle of the Sphinx. In the shape of the animals which come to the aid of the child in the fairy tale, it shows that nature not only is subservient to the myth, but much prefers to be aligned with man. The wisest thing, so the fairy tale taught mankind, is olden times and teaches children to this day, is to meet the forces of the mythical world with cunning and with high spirits. This is how the fairy tale polarizes Mut, courage, dividing it dialectically into Untermut, that is, cunning, and Ubermut, high spirits. The liberating magic which the fairy tale has at its disposal does not bring nature into play in a mythical way, but points to its complicity with liberated man. A mature man feels this complicity only occasionally, that is, when he is happy, but the child first meets it in fairy tales, and it makes him happy.
Few storytellers have displayed so profound a kinship with the spirit of the fairy tale as did Leskov. This involves tendencies that were promoted by the dogmas of the Greek Orthodox Church. As is well known, Origen's speculation about apokatastasis, the entry of all souls into paradise, which was rejected by the Roman Church, plays a significant part in these dogmas. Leskov was very much influenced by Origen and planned to translate his work on first principles. In keeping with Russian folk belief, he interpreted the resurrection less as a transfiguration than as a disenchantment, in a sense akin to the fairy tale. Such an interpretation of Origen is at the bottom of The Enchanted Pilgrim. In this, as in many other tales by Leskov, a hybrid between fairy tale and legend is involved, not unlike that hybrid which Ernst Bloch mentions in a connection in which he utilizes our distinction between myth and fairy tale in his fashion. A hybrid between fairy tale and legend, he says, contains figuratively mythical elements whose effect is certainly captivating and static and yet not outside man. In a legend there are Taoist figures, especially very old ones, which are mythical in this sense. For instance, the couple Philemon and Baucis magically escaped through in natural repose. And surely there is a similar relationship between fairy tale and legend in the Taoist climate of Gethelf, which, to be sure, is on a much lower level. At certain points, it divorces the legend from the locality of the spell, rescues the flame of life, the specifically human flame of life, calmly burning within as without. Magically escaped are the beings that lead the procession of Leskov's creations, the righteous ones. Pavlin, Figura, the toupee artiste, the bear keeper, the helpful sentry, all of them embodiments of wisdom, kindness, comfort the world, crowd about the storyteller. They are unmistakably suffused with the imago of his mother. This is how Leskov describes her. She was so thoroughly good that she was not capable of harming any man, nor even an animal. She ate neither meat nor fish, because she had such pity for living creatures. Sometimes my father used to reproach her with this, but she answered, "I have raised the little animals myself. They are like my children to me. I can't eat my own children, can I?" She would not eat me at a neighbor's house either. "I have even seen them alive," she would say. "They are my acquaintances. I can't eat my acquaintances, can I?" The righteous man is the advocate for created things, and at the same time he is their highest embodiment. In Leskov, he has a maternal touch which was occasionally intensified into the mythical, and thus, to be sure, endangers the purity of the fairy tale. Typical of this is the protagonist of his story, Khotin, the provider, and Platonida. This figure, a peasant named Pisonsky, is a hermaphrodite. For 12 years, his mother raised him as a girl. His male and female organs mature simultaneously, and his bisexuality becomes the symbol of God incarnate. In Leskov's view, the pinnacle of creation has been attained with this, and at the same time he presumably sees it as a bridge established between this world and the other. For these earthly powerful maternal male figures, which again and again claim Leskov's skill as a storyteller, have been removed from obedience to the sexual drive in the bloom of their strength. They do not, however, really embody an ascetic ideal. Rather, the continence of these righteous men has so little privative character that it becomes the elemental counterpoise to uncontrolled lust, which the storyteller has personified in Lady Macbeth of Minsk. And the range between a pavilion and this merchant's wife covers the breadth of the world of created beings. In the hierarchy of his characters, Leskov has no less plumbed its depth.
The hierarchy of the world of created things, which has its apex in the righteous man, reaches down into the abyss of the inanimate by many gradations.
In this connection, one particular has to be noted.
This whole created world speaks not so much with the human voice as with what could be called the voice of nature, in the title of one of Leskov's most significant stories. The story deals with the petty official Philip Filipovich, who leaves no stone unturned to get the chance to have as his house guest a field marshal passing through his little town. He manages to do so. The guest, who is at first surprised at the clerk's urgent invitation, gradually comes to believe that he recognizes in him someone he must have met previously. But who is he? He cannot remember. The strange thing is that the host, for his part, is not willing to reveal his identity. Instead, he puts off the high personage from day to day, saying that the voice of nature will not fail to speak distinctly to him one day. This goes on until finally the guest, shortly before continuing on his journey, must grant the host's public request to let the voice of nature resound. Thereupon the host's wife withdraws. She returned with a big, brightly polished copper hunting horn, which she gave to her husband. He took the horn, put it to his lips, and was at the same instant as though transformed. Hardly had he inflated his cheeks and produced a tone as powerful as the rolling of thunder, when the field marshal cried, "Stop! I've got it now, brother. This makes me recognize you at once.
You are the bugler from the regiment of Jaegers.
And because you were so honest, I sent you to keep an eye on the crooked supplies supervisor." "That's it, Your Excellency," answered the host. "I didn't want to remind you of this myself, but wanted to let the voice of nature speak." The way the profundity of the story is hidden beneath its silliness conveys an idea of Leskov's magnificent humor. This humor is confirmed in the same story in an even more cryptic way. We have heard that because of his honesty, the official was assigned to watch a crooked supplies supervisor. This is what we are told at the end, in the recognition scene. At the very beginning of the story, however, we learn the following about the host. All the inhabitants of the town were acquainted with the man, and they knew that he did not hold a high office, for he was neither a state official nor a military man, but a little supervisor at the tiny supply depot, where together with the rats he chewed on the state rusks and boot soles, and in the course of time had chewed himself together a nice little frame house. It is evident that the story reflects the traditional sympathy which storytellers have for rascals and crooks. All the literature of farce bears witness to it, nor is it denied on the heights of art. All Hebel characters, the Brazenine Miller, Tinderfreighter,
and Red Dieter, have been his most faithful companions.
And yet for Hebel, too, the righteous man has the main role in the
Theatrum Mundi.
But because no one is actually up to this role, it keeps changing hands. Now it is the tramp. Now the haggling Jewish peddler, now the man of limited intelligence who steps in to play this part. In every single case, it is a guest performance, a moral improvisation. Hebel is a casuist. He will not for anything take a stand with any principle, but he does not reject it either. For any principle can at some time become the instrument of the righteous man. Compare this with Leskov's attitude. I realize, he writes in his story,
apropos of the Kreutzer Sonata,
that my thinking is based much more on a practical view of life than on abstract philosophy or lofty morality. But I am nevertheless used to thinking the way I do. To be sure, the moral catastrophes that appear in Leskov's world are the moral incidents in Hebel's world as the great. Silence flowing of the Volga is to the babbling, rushing little millstream. Among Leskov's historical tales, there were several in which passions are at work as destructively as the wrath of Achilles or the hatred of Hagen. It is astonishing how fearfully the world can darken for this author, and with what majesty evil can raise its scepter. Leskov's Leskov has evidently no moods, and this is probably one of the few characteristics he shares with Dostoevsky, in which he was a close antinomian ethics. The elemental natures in his tales from olden times go to the limit in their ruthless passion, but it is precisely the mystics who have been inclined to see this limit as the point at which utter depravity turns into saintliness.
The lower Leskov descends on the scale of created things, the more obviously does his way of viewing things approach the mystical. Actually, as will be shown, there is much evidence that in this too, a characteristic is revealed which is inherent in the nature of the storyteller. To be sure, only a few have ventured into the depths of inanimate nature, and in modern literature there is not much in which the voice of the anonymous storyteller, who is prior to all literature, resounds so clearly as it does in Leskov's story, The Alexandrite. It deals with a semi-precious stone, the chrysoberyl. The mineral is the lowest stratum of created things. For the storyteller, however, it is directly joined to the highest. To him it is granted to see in this chrysoberyl a natural prophecy of petrified, lifeless nature concerning the historical world in which he himself lives. This world is the world of Alexander II. The storyteller, or rather, the man to whom he attributes his own knowledge, is a gem engraver named Wenzel, who has achieved the greatest conceivable skill in his art. One can juxtapose him with the silversmiths of Tula and say that, in the spirit of Leskov, the perfect artisan has access to the innermost chamber of the realm of created things. He is an incarnation of the devout. We are told of this gem cutter. He suddenly squeezed my hand, on which was the ring with the Alexandrite, which is known to sparkle red in artificial light, and cried, "Look, here it is, the prophetic Russian stone, O crafty Siberian." It was always green as hope, and only toward evening was it suffused with blood. It was that way from the beginning of the world, but it concealed itself for a long time, lay hidden in the earth, and permitted itself to be found only in the day when the Tsar Alexander was declared of age. When a great sorcerer had come to Siberia to find the stone, a magician— "What nonsense are you talking?" I interrupted him. "This stone wasn't found by a magician at all. It was a scholar named Nordenskjöld." "A magician, I tell you, a magician," screamed Wenzel in a loud voice. "Just look, what a stone. A green morning is in it, a bloody evening. This is fate, the fate of noble Tsar Alexander." With these words, old Wenzel turned to the wall, propped his head on his elbows, and began to sob. One can hardly come any closer to the meaning of this significant story than by some words which Paul Valery wrote in a very remote context. "Artistic observation," he says in Reflections on a Woman Artist whose work consisted in the silk embroidery of figures, "can attain an almost mystical depth. The objects on which it falls lose their names. Light and shade form very particular systems, present very individual questions, which depend upon no knowledge and are derived from no practice, but get their existence and value exclusively from a certain accord of the soul, the eye, and the hand of someone who is born to perceive them, and evoke them in his own inner self." With these words, soul, eye, and hand are brought into connection, interacting with one another. They determine a practice. We are no longer familiar with this practice. The role of the hand in production has become more modest, and the place it filled in storytelling lies waste. After all, storytelling in its sensory aspect is by no means a job for the voice alone. Rather, in genuine storytelling, the hand plays a part which supports what is expressed in 100 ways with its gestures trained by work. That old coordination of the soul, the eye, and the hand, which emerges in Valerie's words, is that of the artisan which we encounter wherever the art of storytelling is at home. In fact, one can go on and ask oneself whether the relationship of the storyteller to his material, human life is not in itself a craftsman's relationship, whether it is not his very task to fashion the raw material of experience, his own and that of others, in a solid, useful, and a unique way. It is a kind of procedure which may perhaps most adequately be exemplified by the proverb if one thinks of it as an ideogram of a story. A proverb, one might say, is a ruin which stands on the site of an old story, and in which a moral twines about a happening like ivy around a wall. Seen in this way, the storyteller joins the ranks of the teachers and sages. He has counsel, not for a few situations, as the proverb does, but for many, like the sage, for it is granted to him to reach back to a whole lifetime, a life, incidentally, that comprises not only his own experience, but no little of the experience of others. What the storyteller knows from hearsay is added to his own. His gift is the ability to relate his life, his distinction to be able to tell his entire life. The storyteller, he is the man who would let the wick of his life be consumed completely by the gentle flame of his story. This is the basis of the incomparable aura about the storyteller, in Leskov as in Hauff, in Poe as in Stevenson. The storyteller is the figure in which the righteous man encounters himself.